Okay, hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome and thank you for being here. I am Dr. Gloria Boutte at the University of South Carolina, and I am the Okay, hello. Good evening, everyone, and welcome and thank you for being here. I am Dr. Gloria Boutte. Sorry, I've got to take off this.
If you were good at singing the national anthem, you'd be really good at that and a big
Just let's see if this is gonna work without doing all that. I think I have it now. I practiced, but it's I'm the tech person in case you didn't figure that out. Okay, everybody, let's see. Am I sharing my screen? Share screen again. Welcome again, and thank you for being here. Some of you are here, even though Hurricane Nicole is on the way, but we're happy you're here and we're excited. This presentation is part of a series put on by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Education at the University of South Carolina. And hello, family. I see a lot of family out there. So I wanted to start by saying we are thankful to the Indigenous people to whom all the lands in the U.S. belong. In particular, we honor and thank the Congaree, the Catawba, and the Creeks as the traditional inhabitants of the lands on which the city of Columbia is built. And we honor Indigenous people who came before us, and we offer this presentation and this work that we do as a small effort toward our collective healing. It's a way of speaking truth to power and naming and acknowledging and trying to heal for the wrongs that have been done historically. So we're excited about our program today. Special thanks to Dr. Timothy San Pedro and Dr. Emma Elliott for being our speakers today. You see the agenda. We won't take a lot of time. I know you came to hear them. And so we're going to start with greetings and welcomes from Dean Dr. Tommy Hodges at the University of South Carolina in the College of Education.
Well, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. On behalf of the College of Education at the University of South Carolina, I just want to welcome you all this evening. I am particularly excited tonight to witness a manifestation of our college's commitments to justice and equity in the launch of the Diaspora Symposium series. Tonight, along with the remainder of this series, is the creation of the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, a Carolina Distinguished Professor and Executive Director and founder of the Center for Education and Equity of African American Students, Dr. Gloria Boutte. I can tell you, and I know all of you know this as well, it's an absolute blessing to get to work with Gloria, to learn from her each and every day. And I know that this series is going to be a shining example of her leadership. So just as she said, we want to get out of the way so you can hear more from the speakers. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Boutte.
Thank you, Dean Hodges. And I'm seeing people from all over. I see Helen from Australia. So hello, it's 6 a.m. over there. Thank you for waking up. Why don't people just put in the chat box places you're from and put your names? I see lots of family. I see Badu there. I see Eli with your dog. I see Anapon from Nigeria. And so we've got an international group here. So excited about seeing everybody here. I'm going to do a quick welcome just to kind of frame this symposium series. And then we're going to get right to it and have Ms. Sade Collins, who is a teacher with the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students. She will introduce one of the speakers, and Dr. Susie Long, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of South Carolina, will introduce the other. And then we'll get right into it and have some time for dialogue. If you want to receive articles, there's a link that has been put in the chat box. Please sign up that way and we'll send you the articles. So recently, when I was in Australia as a visiting scholar, I showed this cover because we were talking about Aboriginal people, one of the indigenous peoples in the world. And I asked the participants to think about, imagine what it would feel like to only read Aboriginal texts throughout primary school and secondary school. And, people really thought about what that would feel like. And just to complicate it, what would it be like to have only Aboriginal teachers in this case? And so for people who were white, people had a hard time imagining that and thought, wow, I may not feel included. I may not be engaged, the Aboriginal student in the class, she's like, that would be great, So this whole idea of what is missing is sort of the impetus for this work. Okay, my screen is caught. We're having all kind of technology issues. Give me a minute here. I really do know how to use technology, although it doesn't seem like it here. I don't know what is going on. So let's try to do this again here. It absolutely will not go further. So I'm going to say, just not to waste time, and I'll keep talking while I try to correct this. This is part of a series of talks that we're going to be having. Let's see if this works better. And so if you're not already signed up, do sign up. Let's see, share screen again. So we have another one coming up next month in November, and you can see our wonderful speakers. Most of the people who will be speaking are faculty at the University of South Carolina. We'll have Dr. Kamania Winter-Hort and Dr. Eliza Braden speak on African diaspora literacies. And Dr. Mira Muller, who I also see is on, will be speaking on Jewish diaspora literacy. And Dr. Christina Ya and Dr. Yang Wang will speak on Asian diaspora literacies, and Dr. David Martinez and Dr. Julia Lopez Robinson will speak on Latinx diaspora literacy. And then Dr. Susie Long and Toby Jenkins will bring it home to talk about solidarity and intersections among different diaspora literacies. Let me just explain sort of what is meant by diaspora literacies. One of the reasons that I decided to do this series was because we know that various ethnic literacies are understudied or misrepresented, distorted in colleges of education here at USC and actually across the nation. And so the goal was to focus on these 5 diaspora literacies. And by literacy, it means just to be literate, be informed about the culture, about the history, perspectives of people from these particular groups. And so my goal was to put diaspora literacies on our radar and understand that one presentation won't do everything, but we want it on our collective radar as faculty, staff, and students and community members. Importantly, my goal is to hopefully activate and mobilize these knowledge bases in our respective programs of studies. For example, as we think about the theories we use, the pedagogies, and the research, we want to make sure that they reflect these literacies. And when we think about the world population, we can see that many of these literacies, these people in the diaspora from the different ethnic groups are underrepresented. Asian people making about 60% of the world's population. Africa, another 1.3 billion. Sorry, I didn't highlight that one. But we can see that there are places where the voices are missing. In my book, Educating African American Students, I often have students think about culturally relevant teaching or culturally relevant pedagogy. And I used Gloria Ladson-Billen's conception and just thinking about, major dimensions that need to be included. She talks about academic excellence, cultural competence in terms of having mirrors where children see themselves reflected, cultural competence where students have windows where they learn about other worlds, and critical consciousness. And if you look at this, one of the things I ask students to think about and teachers is, if you look at these different diasporic groups, how likely are they to experience academic achievement? And they use a scale from 1 to 5. And the importance of that in terms of thinking about how likely are children to achieve more when they are engaged, when they see themselves represented. How likely are they to see mirrors of themselves where the content reflects their lives? How likely are they to learn about lives beyond their own? And how likely are they to be critically engaged? And so just with the mirrors and windows piece, this is sort of how it usually pans out. In terms of mirrors, how likely is it that the content, if we do content analysis of school curricula, P through university level, we find that there are very few mirrors for people of color and people from diaspora groups, with the exception of European diaspora people. We have many, many windows there, many, many mirrors there. In terms of windows, you see it's just the reverse. White children learn very little about worlds beyond their own, cultures beyond their own, perspectives, theories, research, and children of color learn a lot about cultures other than their own, although it's mostly white. So this series seeks to address all of that. And again, it's stuck again, and I'm not sure why, but we'll just kind of do it like this. The last two things I wanted to say, let's see if I can play this here. I'm not sure why this is getting stuck like this. I'm just cutting it out now. And this has been recorded. They get to see my wonderful skills. I wanted to recognize this month as National American Heritage Month, Native American Heritage Month. And this picture that Ibn Kendi put on his Twitter in 2021 is a really wonderful picture of a mirror. His African-American daughter, he introduces her to books about Indigenous people. And I could talk a long time, of course I won't, but there are variations within and among Indigenous nations as with other groups. And so books can be mirrors and windows at the same time, depending on which nation we're talking about. And lastly, as we're thinking about teaching about these groups, let's be sure to talk about what happened before contact with Europeans, people of color, the ethnic diaspora groups that we're talking about did not become human once they came in contact with Europeans. They are not acultural. They had full histories, full lives. And so that's very important to start the stories there. And I also recommend talking about what happens at the point of contact with Europeans. How did that change the texture of the culture, of the experiences, and so forth? And then make sure we do full circle where we show the continuities, the cultural continuities across time as well. And in terms of thinking about Indigenous people and the other groups we're going to talk about, it's important to tell the stories of resistance, of agency, and joy as well. And finally, this series, I hope I'm inviting people to think about their own respected spaces, the courses that you teach, your programs that you have. And it took a few questions from an audit, from an interrogations piece that was put together by the Anti-Racist Collective. You see us pictured down there. And ask you to think as you're listening to the presentations, how can I normalize or make it regular in my units of studies, information about Indigenous joy, brilliance, and so forth, not only during the month of November, but year-round. And I highlighted Indigenous because we can insert any group in there, right? How can I center Indigenous scholars and theories and research and pedagogies I use to really think about that? What are we using? What's missing? Do the textbooks and course resources portray Indigenous people as often as white people? So do a critique of what we're doing. And how am I guiding my students to ask critical questions, to examine texts for authenticity, stereotypes, and misinformation? Are the expert scholars and guests that I invite to my classroom, do they represent Indigenous communities? Am I guiding my students to address the inaccuracies, the distortions and omissions, and thinking about our professional books as well? That's sort of how we're thinking about it. And I'm going to stop talking and go ahead and pass the mic to Ms. Sade Collins so she can introduce one of our speakers.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Sade Collins, and I am a teacher for the Center for the Education and Equity of African American Students. And I welcome you as well today. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Emma Elliott. Dr. Emma Elliott is an assistant professor in the Department of Learning Sciences and Human Development in the College of Education at the University of Washington. She holds both a PhD in educational psychology and a Master of Social Work in Children, Youth, and Families. A large part of her research centers on understanding the meanings and explanations of suicidal behavior from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. By employing a strengths-based approach to recovery, Dr. Elliott rigorously engages youth, families, and communities in the development of integrated behavioral health interventions to address complex social issues. Her research centers ethical frameworks generated by Indigenous and place-based knowledges and practices to create process-centered approaches that illuminate Indigenous pathways toward collective livelihood. Dr. Elliott is currently partnering with members of the Cowichan tribes to design programming to strengthen the physical, mental, intellectual, and cultural health of the community. The interdisciplinary intersections of her research include contemporary Indigenous issues, culture, learning, and human development, and trauma prevention and recovery. We would like to welcome Dr. Emma Elliott. I will now turn it over to Dr. Susie Long for our second introduction.
Thank you, Sade, and welcome, Dr. Elliott. As I introduced Dr. San Pedro, I'm interweaving it a little bit with some thanks to Dr. Elliott as well, from the University of Washington, and Dr. San Pedro is from the Ohio State University. So to celebrate and honor their work as a team, I'm going to interweave a few words about the two of them together. First of all, Dr. Elliott, I'm thrilled to meet you and to learn about the amazing work that you're doing, which was a wonderful opportunity I had to be able to spend some time with your work focused on Indigenous education, land-based pedagogy, and mental health. Dr. San Pedro, I am excited to be able to introduce you. Our relationship goes back, I was trying to figure it out, but I think about 12 years. And for everybody, we met each other through the National Council of Teachers of English program called Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color, where Tim was a fellow and I was a learner. But what was very clear from the very first time I met Tim was that he's in this work for the right reasons. His kind demeanor and clear dedication to engaging in work that matters, while his knowledge and experience are certainly enviable, he never grandstands. Instead, he shares his insights, knowledge, and experience with a generosity and convictions about transformation that's imperative. So while I could rattle off pages and pages of awards and honors and publications and presentations, I'll leave the audience to enjoy looking up Dr. San Pedro's CV. But for this introduction, I want to say that Tim and Dr. Elliott, who I'm just getting to know, are clearly scholars and scholar activists who are first community members because they care deeply about not only the work they do and the people, but the people who share in that work. With them. And they do this work not for another line on their CV, but this is because it is who they are. What's really important, and I think Dr. Putti was prefacing this so beautifully, is that their work leads the way for us to a true dismantling of colonial practices that have silenced, oppressed, and distorted for centuries. They change the way we think about data. There are so many ways that they do this. Dr. Elliott writes extensively about this, as does Dr. San Pedro. One example of that is rich in its insight for all of us. Dr. Elliott writes about valuing the narrative. And here's what she says: for Indigenous peoples, language serves as the foundation of intergenerational transmission of knowledge, including sacred traditions, healing practices, and ways of being in the world. And in Tim's latest book, and I love the title, Protecting the Promise, Indigenous Education Between Mothers and Their Children, he writes that we've got to push back. We've got to push back on Western research norms and situate the lessons that are taught us through stories and conversations. And in his case, these were stories and conversations between Indigenous mothers and their children at home. He writes about the importance of we, researchers engaging participants as co-researchers, genuinely and truly, not just rhetorically. So therefore, he writes, we co-developed this research project, the methods we used, and we developed the hope of what it could be, what it could become. We created this work together in the space between us, not in the absence of one another. And so finally, in the foreword to his most recent book, we hear this quote: one of my favorite prayers is, may we raise our babies with Indigenous love rather than our colonial pain. And so I close by saying, we cannot walk away from the work of Dr. Elliott and Dr. San Pedro without renewed conviction to engage in overturning so that we can create what must be. Thank you.
Ooh, wow. Susie, thank you for that introduction. I'm all in my feels already. And it's just such an honor to be here, to be with you all, to have a worldwide audience, and just to share space with Emma. And thank you so much for those introductions, and for also weaving the ways that Emma and I are in relation. And so I don't know if this is in line with what had been envisioned for the diasporic literacies, but we're entering into this conversation in ways of working with others and thinking about the traditional notions of research, disrupting traditional notions of research, so that we can center care, mutuality, respect, reverence, the things that are taught to us by our communities. But I'll hand it over to Emma to introduce the session and get us started. Emma, you're muted.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Susie, for such a beautiful introduction. I, like Tim, I'm already excited and feeling all of the emotion of being here and thinking together about how these feelings, how this discomfort, how this excitement, and how the things that we'll experience this evening can contribute to the transformative approaches that we so desperately need in this moment in time. And, it is, we don't know what you are expecting directly, but we do know that we're offering something through which all of us can together continue to become familiar with diverse respective knowledge bases. And that's what Gloria had mentioned in their introduction about diasporic literacies. So I'm feeling good about the moment, and I feel with gratitude to be here. So I think we can go ahead, if you don't mind, Tim, and just share screen, and we can go ahead and get started there. Siamnatsiaya, Plemutsia Tala, Heitzaka, Ni Alpmitst Atana Quail, Yath Ut Hakwashta, Not so much Squallowin. Heitzaka. Dear relatives and colleagues, I'm honored to be here with you today, and I'm joining you from the Lushootseed speaking territory of the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, the Suquamish, the Tulalip, the Snoqualmie, and the Puyallup nations here in Seattle, Washington. As a descendant of these lands, I give thanks to the people, the plants, the animals, the water, the sky, all for sustaining us, including the lands on which we live and work, and including the work that we're going to be doing today and moving forward. And with that, I'm honored and grateful to be sharing this space with Dr. Tim San Pedro, and I can turn it over right there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just so glad to be here to share this space with you all in multiple locations. And as I mentioned earlier, it's just such an honor to learn from and alongside Emma as we walk this earth together. I join you from Central Ohio, homelands of the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, and Miami, and other nations who have strong ties to these lands. Just a little bit about myself. I'm Filipino American who from the age of 4 grew up on the Flathead Indian Reservation and with friends and families who are Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille and other Indigenous peoples who made that place their home. And so for me, I speak from a place of care, of love and support, from a place of invitation to join into conversations such as this through the invitation of powerful Indigenous peoples who have welcomed me into their lives, into their homes, into their practices.
And so when we think about that, we think about this moment in time and we think about our responsibility as educators. We get to spend every single day thinking and reflecting and writing and engaging, and doing all of the things. And we can't take that responsibility lightly. We have this opportunity in this moment in time to really think about how we can contribute to transformative practices. And, it's difficult. It's a difficult time. And yet when our future generations ask or wonder, how did we survive this moment? How did we survive a massive global pandemic or massive white supremacy around the world, or police violence against Black and Brown people? How are we getting through all of these difficulties? What are the stories that we want to tell? This is our opportunity to really think deeply about that narrative. And so with that, Tim and I are engaging Indigenous intellectual tradition as a theoretical approach, and we're engaging Indigenous storying as a methodological approach to demonstrate both theoretically and practically what kinds of knowledge can be created and co-created in these everyday experiences, as Dr. Long and Dr. San Pedro have already previously shared, even in their relationship introduction. And so before we go into that, I want to give you some sort of an idea about how Indigenous people think about land. And first, to share a quote.
Yeah, for most, if not all Indigenous peoples, being Indigenous means to live in relationship with the place where one is born. So, and in that way, I'm Cowichan or Cowichan, as we say, and who we are. That is our sense of collective identity, our existential understanding of self, the responsibilities associated with that, the stories that we came to be in this place. All of these things have been developed in relationship to the land, and the language has been developed in relationship to the land. And these provide frameworks for what it means to be for what it means to be a Cowichan person. So there's these elements of land and identity, which inform the way that we think about who we are and our responsibilities, which also inform how we move about in the world, right? All of these kinds of worldviews, which we call ontologies, or moral and ethical commitments, which we call axiologies, inform our everyday social interaction, including as educators and researchers and practitioners who are contributing to a really powerful revolution. Knowledge is co-created within the relational dynamic of self in relation, meaning that the relational dynamic between self, others, and natures is central.
And to draw the parallel even more specifically, we need to understand these contextual factors if we're really going to deeply contribute to Indigenous decolonization and Black contribute toward anti-racism and anti-indigeneity. We have to be intentional about this. We have to understand sort of all these contextual and varying factors, right? We can't compartmentalize anymore. We can't isolate anymore. We have to think about ourselves as existing within these social and cultural relationships that sustain us. And that's why we're offering Indigenous knowledge systems, because it's a knowledge system that offers ethical approaches and sustainability. You know, we recognize that 80% of the world's biodiversity is held within Indigenous territory. And that's not a mistake, right? So we want to think about those things and offer this call to action that says we have this opportunity, we have this responsibility, and we have pathways forward.
Knowing something is bound to how we develop a relationship with it. Knowledge is the byproduct of slow and deliberate dialogue with an idea, with others knowing, or with one's own experience with the world. I'll just move to the next one.
Thanks.
And then finally, knowing is embodied and in union with cognition. Our thinking body is not separated from our feeling mind. It's not how well you can quote theory. It's whether those ideas affect how you act. And so to build with Emma and to build with the quotes that we have here, I'm thinking about the training that we received, or that I received, I should say, as I was training to become a scholar, training to become a researcher. And the lessons that were taught to me were harmful. And I knew that at the time. I remember one instructor saying in a research methodologies class that who said, you know, once the IRB expires, so do your relationships with the people. And I remember saying at the time, that's BS. I'm pretty sure I said something to that effect. And he called me out on it and asked for me to extend my utterance. And I said, if all we're doing is pretending to be in relationship with people, knowing that there's an expiration date to it and no relationship beyond it, then your definition of research is deeply problematic. And so in relation to this quote here, you know, it's how we act in this world. It's not just what we do as researchers, as scholars. It's who we are as people, the communities that we are part of, the relationships that we have, the relationships that we begin with and continue. And for Emma and I, this is beyond a job. And in Susie's introduction, this is an opportunity for us to work with, to collaborate, to build with the people and places that we care so deeply about. And so as we move through our stories this evening, we want to offer just the ways we're seeing and understanding key terms that we'll be referencing either directly or indirectly through our presentation today.
So ontology is a theory or set of beliefs about the world. So essentially we interchange that to some degree with our worldview. Epistemology, defined as knowledge nested within the social relations of knowledge production, how we come to know what we know. And of course, ontoepistemologies is the nature of reality coupled with the social and relational nature of knowledge production. So these are big, fancy words to say essentially our beliefs about the world, how we come to know what we know, and the moral and ethical qualities associated with those beliefs that guide our everyday social interaction. And we're offering stories today because stories are who we are. They're both a method and a meaning. They spring forth from a holistic epistemology and are the relational glue in a socially interdependent knowledge system. We know stories transmit knowledge. We know stories help us heal from trauma. We know stories narrate and re-narrate our identity across time over and over and over again. And that's why we're offering stories today as a method of co-constructing knowledge together in ethical and sustainable ways.
And so collectively, building with those key terms, we share our emerging understandings of Indigenous storying, which has three deeply interrelated elements: storyteller, story listener, and the story itself, which aids in a clear understanding of the methodological contribution. Obviously, those telling a story are the storytellers, while those listening to a story are story listeners. But in a dialogic interaction, these roles move back and forth as ideas are connecting, constructing, and weaving into a shared story. Story, then, is that dialogic space between people transmitted through words, orally and written, but also through other means, such as art and music, to expand one's understanding of self in relation to one's surroundings. It provides opportunities to critically examine the interactions between one's own history, culture, and life experiences when they come into contact with another's realities. And so, the emphasis that we're focusing on here is this term of Indigenous storying. And Em and I have had multiple conversations over a long period of time of what this means in our lives, what this means in our research, and how we can move forward in ways that honor those who thought about this work before us. This is not something, a term that was created by us. Ideas are never in isolation. And so we want to make sure that throughout this presentation, we give homage and credit to those who helped us in thinking through this.
So to that end, and the whole entire crux of this talk today is in what ways can Indigenous intellectual traditions, such as these theories and ideas about relationality and these ideas about Indigenous storying as a methodological approach, what can those tell us about teaching and learning? What can they tell us about educational research or approaches to research itself? So we're going to, just on account of time, there's going to be maybe a few slides that Tim and I on the fly will decide to spend more time with or less, depending on. So we could go ahead and move to the next slide. And so just so what we're up to today is Tim and I will share a little bit about our own standpoints, our own positionalities, how we came to this space. And then, of course, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this moment in time that we have as we're addressing these multiple pandemics. Briefly, and we've already touched a lot on this, but we're going to talk a lot more about storying and relationality, and in particular offer stories today of survival, of transcendence, and of collective dreaming that can help us think together about what this might offer ourselves as educators, researchers, and practitioners, and policymakers and decision makers. So we can go ahead and move on.
And I just want to say that stories need context. We need to know who's telling the story for it to have meaning and connection to our lives. And I think as we revise, as we move forward, I'll probably shorten a little bit about who I am, but we're going to just share about how we are in relation to people, to lands, and to each other briefly.
Yeah, so I am Cowichan from Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I have two children, Caspian and Story. You'll see them on the right-hand side. They're here with us tonight. They're fending for themselves because that's more exciting than hanging out with Mama on her computer while she just talks and talks and talks. So they're going to come and hang out if they want to hang out. I have 10 siblings. I'm one of 10. My mom has 26 grandchildren in Vancouver, and we're Cowichan. And for us, we were raised without running water and electricity. And my dad was an activist in the 1970s. He built a traditional fishing weir in opposition to the federal government, who said that we couldn't fish for our sustenance. My mom is a medicine person, and she today uses her time and energy sharing what she knows about plants as medicine. And it's from these standpoints and these commitments that my family had from even before I was born that we continue to have these kinds of conversations, right? So the way that we ended up where we are isn't an accident. And when we think about our epistemic journey, my dad was fighting for Indigenous rights. My mom is thinking about healing practices emphasis from an Indigenous perspective. And somehow I ended up framing my own thinking and my academic journey around healing and indigeneity and the strengths of our intellectual tradition. And so we think that that has something to say about how we've come to know our work, how we interpret ourselves, and of course, our objectivity and so on about the work that we're sharing with you today. And you'll be able to see the pieces of our lives and the stories of our lives as they're reflected, even in the stories of our work, which, as Tim mentioned, isn't separate from our personal in a lot of ways. Zapka.
Yeah. And so for me, I grew up on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Western Montana, on the south end of Flathead Lake, and amidst the beautiful mountains that are there. And I get reminded almost monthly from my mother. These are all pictures of hers, of what I'm missing when I am not home. And so I am constantly homesick, constantly longing for the people and places of my youth, and have always had an opportunity to go back there and visit and reconnect. And so for me, as I shared in my introduction, my positionality, it matters. I grew up in a blended home. I have two older sisters here in the upper left. That's me on the very left. Our families combined with another. And I grew up around and with Salish Kootenai Pondere and other Indigenous peoples who were there playing res ball, understanding who we are as we got older. But there was something that was missing from our education that I started to develop a critical consciousness about my sophomore, junior year. And that was that the stories that were held in the lands and in the homes of my friends and their families were not included in schooling spaces. And so when I sought my PhD, I was welcomed into a classroom where those stories were centered, a 12th grade English elective course that focused on Native American literatures and histories. And I saw students light up when their stories and histories were centered, when they had opportunities to develop and build curriculum with the teacher. And in the upper right, those are the students that I had a chance to reconnect with a few summers back. And in the middle, Eileen, who's holding her baby, she shared with me a story in class. And she said, you know, I told my father about this class that's happening. And I started to teach him lessons that we're learning. And he said, I think it's time that we learn the language, that you learn the language. And he started to speak Dene to her exclusively. And at that time, I wanted to understand how powerful those lessons are that are happening in the community and in the homes. And oftentimes, you know, when we think about educational research, it's in schooling settings. And so there's so much more that's happening outside of schooling settings. And I wanted to understand the intergenerational lessons that was happening in the community. And so on the bottom left, that's a collective of people, Indigenous mothers who you'll hear from later on, who welcomed me into their lives and shared stories of what it means to raise powerful Indigenous youth, the navigation that they had to engage in academic or in schooling spaces, and the beautiful lessons that are being taught in the home. And so I got to be with them and share space with them. And they are aunties to my young one who's on the bottom right, Kindred, who have almost all of them had the chance to meet and connect with him. And I just want to share quickly just what that looks like, the joy, the laughter, the love. This is Mali, Michael's daughter, and I had a chance to share space with them. And we are family, and family sounds like this.
1, 2, 3. Yeah! Whoa! 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 It's a bumpy ride. Can she last much longer? I don't know. Oh no!
We needed Molly in our lives. Thanks, Tim. And then just briefly about our relationship. I first met Tim in 2014 when he gave a talk at the American Educational Research Association. And after the talk, we've had conversations about how his work was connecting and sparking ideas for me. And also I shared with him the emotional stress, because my first area of expertise is in Indigenous suicide and understanding the impact of the fracture to our relationships on our people. And anyway, it was just a really stressful moment. So I cried my eyeballs out to Tim in the lobby of some conference hotel, and he held me in that, not physically, but he held that space, and he was able to just be there while I sort of processed some of that, with recognition that sometimes the work that we take on, because of the commitment, because of the relationships, are just so deeply and profoundly impactful for us. So I'm grateful, because across the years, as you can see, with my little ones, or maybe when I was pregnant there, across the years, we've had these opportunities to reconnect, and even more so, especially during the pandemic, to spend time virtually thinking together about these things.
And my recollection of that moment was how powerful the stories that you shared with me, how vulnerable you were within that moment. And sometimes people walk into your life and you don't ever let them go. And that was one of those moments. And I'm so happy to share this space with you, Emma. So we wanted to sort of to frame, it's not only important who is sharing the story, but the context within which these stories are shared. And we want to acknowledge that we are at the intersections of multiple pandemics. And we have an opportunity to create anew and otherwise. And this scholar, Arundhati Roy, she helps us with a useful metaphor of the portal, and how pandemics have historically been a space for us to think through a portal, to think through an otherwise, a refusal to move back to normality. And so we are in this moment in time, and there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of pushback to a return to spaces and things that were not productive for the people of our communities and homes. So we'll just share this briefly.
What is this thing that has happened to us? It's a virus, yes. In and of itself, it holds no moral brief. But it's definitely more than a virus. Some believe it's God's way of bringing us to our senses. Others, that it's a Chinese conspiracy to take over the world. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past, and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it.
So I think that this is where we all put our hands together like this in the middle and say something along the lines of, who's with me? We offer, this call to action, and again, ask. Sorry, Tim, I don't know where we're at, but again, ask, us to think about approaches that are consequential and deliberate, sustainable, ethical, and transformative. And, we ask again, what stories do we want to collectively tell? And I think from there, we'll go ahead and go forward. And I can share a couple of stories, and embedded within the stories that Tim and I will share with you will be the stories of survival and resilience and transcendence, and hopefully pathways forward. The nature of storying is that we won't assume what you're going to get out of the story. The nature of storying, as the nature of knowledge, is that every single time you hear these stories, something different will be offered to you. And we offer the framework of Indigenous relationality. As Indigenous peoples, we understand ourselves to be connected within a vast system of relationships across people and plants and animals, natural world, water elements, and our ancestors. And it's these relationships that are deeply imbued with these responsibilities that we have to care and nurture and sustain, not just each other as in human beings, but all living beings. And after that, of course, we offer sort of brief ideas about Indigenous storying, and we can go to the next slide. So in the spring of 2012, I was beginning to think about what my dissertation topic was going to be. And I knew that I wanted it to be something that was meaningful to the community. And my sister-in-law called me, and she usually doesn't call me on the phone. She usually Facebook messages me. So I knew that something was up. And I could hear her in the background scurrying around. And she said that Tammy's partner had died by suicide. And she didn't know what our stories were around suicide. She didn't know how we could support her. And even more, Tammy was on her soccer team. So they didn't know how to, what to say. And they felt like they were walking on eggshells. And I didn't have a response, except for, we need to figure out from our elders what we need to do. And from that point on, we recognized that we have to understand, we have to understand, just as my sister-in-law, who was scurrying around gathering items for the family. She was gathering water in kerchiefs. She was gathering blankets and giveaways. She was preparing to bring things to the family, as we do during grieving times and loss. And we recognize in those moments that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. And that's how I began into working with understanding Indigenous suicide, and subsequently the reasons for becoming a social worker, as well as a learning scientist. And we can go ahead and move to the next slide. And, when the time came that I had to figure out how to respond, and this was actually around the time that I met Tim, how to respond to the deaths by suicide that were happening in our community, the increase in suicidal ideation and behavior. For you guys, if you want to come and say hi, you can, but right now Mama's talking, remember?
Hello, little ones.
She's gonna run. Cass, I need you to take care of it on your own, babe. I'll help you afterwards, okay? And so I wanted to figure out how I can help the community. And I didn't have a degree, and I didn't have money, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I went to my mom and I told her, and she looked at me like First Nations elders do when they know that you already know the answer. And she said, we sit and we eat together. And when we think about what's happening in the moments where we're sitting and eating together, of course, this is physical sustenance. We're being present with each other. I'm asking about your day. I'm telling you that I care about you, or that I want to know what's going on in your life. These are these moments that we have with each other. So that's the emotional. And then we give thanks for the food that's brought to our table each and every day as it is needed. And that's the cultural and the gratitude and the reciprocity. We give thanks for the cooks, right? We acknowledge where the food came from. And it wasn't 3,000 miles away. Here you go. And we think about the healing components, because people across the world have stories about food and the healing nature of food, not just as physical sustenance, but emotional and cultural and spiritual. And when we sit and we eat together, and what my mom was saying that day was that powerful reminder that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. And we can go to the next slide. So I want to share this story with you. And you know, in 2018, Tahlequah, this mother whale, lost her baby in the Puget Sound. And she carried the body of her dead baby for 17 days. And when she needed a moment to go down and get herself some food, somebody in her community held her baby for her. And at the moment that her baby had crossed over into a different world, Tahlequah was surrounded by other orca females. It was reported that there were a handful of other orcas surrounding her as she began her journey. And newspaper articles called this, you know, this a journey of grieving, a journey of loss, right? And when we think about what Tahlequah and her community were telling us about trauma, about getting through difficulty, they were telling us again that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. They were telling us that we need to come together during times of hardship, that we need to hold each other up. Because unresolved trauma will continue to permeate across generations, as intergenerational and historical trauma. And we get a chance to think about that. And we give gratitude to Tahlequah and to her community for giving us some of these lessons, because she reminds us too that trauma heals in the presence of caring others. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide.
That's Mike. Do you want to say anything more, Emma?
You know, no, you know, and I think all of this is about the nature of knowledge and the nature of learning and the nature of healing. There's going to be elements of our stories that are resonating with you. And then we're going to encourage you and push you to think about, but what does this mean for your work? What does this mean for the consequentiality of your contribution? And all of those kinds of things. So I'm happy to turn it over to Tim so that he too can share some stories.
I'm just thinking and sitting with your offerings, Emma, and thinking about, you know, the students that I work with who are also many of them full-time teachers, and the hurt that they're bearing witness to, this rupture that's existed within our society, this attempt to return back to normalcy. There's trauma in that, and they're bearing the weight of that, of the student stories of being absent from one another, being absent from the care, from community for so long. And so I'm thinking about your stories in connection to what teachers right now are experiencing in their everyday experiences and lives. So I just wanted to share a bit about the work that I do that was compiled in this book, Protecting the Promise. And this project came together because there were such powerful stories of language and cultural revitalization that I was seeing in my, in my contact with my friends and families. But I was seeing this disconnect that for the most part, such stories are absent from literature that focuses on Indigenous people. I mean, do a search on intergenerational learning and Indigenous peoples, and you'll see a dearth of damage-based research that comes out and shares what's wrong with communities. And they'll cite literature of the suicide rates. They'll cite alcoholism. They'll cite all of these things that are wrong, that all communities have problems and issues with. And so I kept hearing this dissonance between the two, and I wanted to work with the families and the people who are close with me to think about what intergenerational learning, what education means beyond schooling spaces, and how that occurs. And as my advisor, mentor, and brother, Django Parrish, shares with us in the framing of culturally sustaining pedagogy, he says that culturally sustaining pedagogy happens wherever education sustains the lifeways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. And so within that definition, education for our communities, for many communities, happen beyond schooling spaces. And so I think it's really important as we think about the other side of this portal, that we envision broader understandings and notions of where education exists. It exists not just within school. Yes, absolutely. School is an important place to learn, but there are so many other important spaces that we need to understand, that we need to be witness to, so that we can see the power and transformation that is existing already. And so I wanted to understand what that looked like in the homes. But I had to think through a couple of questions before engaging in this work, such as what would research look like if it were done with long established relationships? And so I went to the homes, sat on the back porches, ate punset, adobo, barbecue, dry bread with my friends. This was even before the IRB was constructed. And I shared with them this idea and the powerful story that Eileen shared with me of being taught her language in the home because something powerful happened in the school. And each of them said absolutely. And right then, on those back porches, in those conversations, we started to envision these projects together. And so just re-emphasizing what Susie shared earlier, the we of the projects, the co of the projects, the co-construction of questions, the collaboration that exists, the co-crafting of research design, the ways that we eventually co-analyzed and co-authored. Although my name is on the front of this book, each of the chapters are authored by the Indigenous mothers and the children themselves. And so I wanted to know how to engage in this work in a good way. And so some questions that popped up were, how do we continue to honor our relations even when the court recorder is on? And how do we share stories beyond our relations in a good way with an unknown audience? And that last part, with an unknown audience, is the difficulty, because when we are talking, as relations do, sometimes we forget that the recorder is there. And as trained educational researchers, we're trained that if it's captured, you include it, right? And so I think we need to reconsider and think about what it means to collect data in a good way, in ways that honor the relationships that were constructed and created. And so I want to offer a few stories in relation to answers to these questions. First is an audio clip from Rue, who this is a picture of us on the graduation stage from the University of Montana, having concluded our programming in journalism there. And just the pride that we had in one another. Her hands on my shoulder. She has a cap that acknowledges and centers her ways of being, her regalia. And the recording that you'll hear is our first recorded session of us thinking through what it means to have that recorder on, and the trust that it takes in order to do so.
I will.
Okay.
Oops.
I will.
Okay, go. You're on.
So any conversations we have are yours to do with what you will, because I completely trust you, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. I trust you so much that you're a steward of the information I'm sharing with you completely. There's not going to be any time that I ask you to turn it off. I believe in you, and this trust is complete and whole.
They'll be envisioned by what you and Sila and others want your story to be. And I'll do the legwork, the transcription, the analysis, but in the end, I'll bring it back to you, and we'll engage in further conversations about what story are we shaping here, and also envisioning the audience that we're talking to, right? In my mind, I want this to impact communities. I want it to impact teachers. I want it to impact people that you work with. I want it to impact the friends that Sila has. So yeah, just in the end, it's our story, and I don't ever want to frame it as mine.
No, I know that. I know that to be true. I just want you to know that in terms of my trust,
Yeah.
I trust even that you're going to allow me that space when needed. And when or when I decide I'm changing it up, because you know that's something that I'll do too.
Absolutely.
So that's when I say I trust you. I even trust you to be able to handle when I feel like I need to say something different or challenge you back or whatever.
Yeah.
That complete trust is deeply rooted in respect and belief that you and I as partners in this process will do fine.
Yeah.
I don't have any concerns.
Oh.
So Rue, if you're watching this, I just want to acknowledge that I did not revise your name. She recently changed her name to Rue. And so this is just an example of I hope you hear the worry in my voice of what it means to do this work with existing relationships. For me, what's on the line, if I do this work in extractive ways, in ways that only benefit me, in ways that aren't shared back with community, is our relationship. And so there's more weight to it for me. There's a heaviness to it, a bit of a burden, but one that I'm willing to carry. And I think in the co-analysis and the co-shaping of stories, we were able to work through what our stories look like beyond us. And so I want to share just a couple of clips of the worry of sharing these stories, but sharing them in a good way.
When I moved to Montana, and having met Tim in high school, I think I can say I'm the one who's known him the longest. So if anyone wants to know any stories, I've got plenty of them. But I just want to echo what everyone else has said, and having a brother, and being able to go to school and see someone who looked like me, in the Filipino sense. I'm also half Filipino. It was really nice to have that identity, because nobody else knew what chicken adobo was. Nobody understood what pancit was. And Tim and I definitely shared lots of good meals together, as well as finding each other and identity and belongingness. So I just want to thank him for that. And as such, it was really easy to be able to share these feelings, the stories that are shared in the book. I do have to say, when I was reading through it, I thought, oh man, I hope people don't take this the wrong way. But it was because I was sharing things with Tim, and I trust him and his writing. I've known him forever, and so I trust his writings, and I trust his interpretation of things. And I think it's really beautiful that we're able to come together and speak about all of this.
Much, Tim. I would also just like to take a second and say, Christina Lemlepsch, for sharing that statement about hoping that these things that we've shared with one another throughout this process are held with love and known that everything that we have done has been with good hearts, and that the decisions we made to include things or not to include things hopefully were made in a good way, never with ill intention. So I also have some of those thoughts.
And so there's worry there, right? When we think about an imagined audience beyond us. And so ways in which that we went about that was to look at those documents before we sent them to the world. I think when we were talking about the three elements of storying: storyteller, story listening, and the story itself, sometimes we hear stories different than the intentions of which they were meant to be shared, right? Yet as researchers, we take those and interpret them through our lenses, oftentimes without bringing those stories back to those who shared them with us. And so it was important for me to bring those stories back to them and say, where did I get it wrong? What are the corrections that need to be made? And when we think about an audience beyond us, Are there things that might need to be removed? And there were certain stories that did need to be removed because family members or community members were mentioned and they didn't want to harm or sever that connection, knowing that this would forever be in book form.
That I'm really, really proud of my brother, Tim. He's the one that made this happen and created this opportunity for us to be in relationship together. And we all find that relationship in the world where you are meant to be in the same space together. And I was lucky enough to be in space with Tim when I was 18 years old, and we were at the University of Montana together. And I'm really grateful for that relationship because it also sustained me like it did you, Michael. He was my brother in arms against a racist institution and was always my silent backup. And I really appreciated that. So kudos to you and this beautiful book.
So I think I'll forgo the last one and just say that, who we are matters. The connections that we have matter. The relationships that we have to one another matters. We need to sit with one another, be with one another, and connecting to Emma's story about how we move forward in healing ways. It means to gather around with one another, to be with one another. And so who we are in these processes, that matters. So I'll turn it over to Emma to move on.
Yeah, beautiful stories. And I appreciate you bringing your relations and the folks whose stories you shared in the book. I appreciate you bringing those voices in tonight. That was beautiful. So we are here, right? And Tim and I just have always had these kinds of conversations about, what are we trying to do, and what are we trying to do anyway, right? And we want our work to be consequential for our generations 100 years from now. So we might not know about it. In fact, we hope, hopefully we won't. But that's what we think about, right? So thinking about how is it that we can use everyday social interaction and relationship and belonging and identity and responsibility and a recognition of heterogeneous and diverse perspectives and knowledges. How is it that we can engage those kinds of things in order to imagine this otherwise? What is the otherwise, right? It's so easy to get trapped into, we should have, and then try to sort of build everything back into some sort of status quo structure because that's what we know and we can't imagine anything other than. But we're saying we have to. Mother Earth has 1 billion years, but human beings do not. Right? So we have to think about how are we teaching our generations about the importance of these nature-culture relations? How are we teaching our generations about the importance of relationships and sustainability and reciprocity? How are we encouraging the next generation of learners that don't become leaders who wholesale Alaska to the highest bidder? Because so far that isn't working out for anybody. And so we imagine an otherwise. What do we want our kids to know? And how do we want them to know it? Constructing an otherwise beyond the portal involves building, nurturing, and sustaining good relations with partners, family, community, land, and the various forms of life she sustains, is challenging and requires sacrifice and vigilance because the constant whisper of the sirens of capital, self above other, self above other, self above other, is relentless and seductive, holding space wears a body down, which is why our collective survivance can only come through strong relations and coalitions. And so, we think about this and you say, wait a second, sacrifice? What? I thought we had already sacrificed so much, right? But if I'm really, truly interested in the project of Indigenous decolonization, or taking, or addressing anti-Black racism, if I'm really interested in all of our collective freedoms together, then I actually do have to be thinking about what I need to give up. I have a really good paying job. My kids have education funds, right? So, but I want to decolonize Indigenous education, but I don't want to give that up. That's risky, right? So what is the underlying fear? Why don't I want to give that up? Because I'm worried my kids might not be educated, right? So again, it's that sort of scarcity mentality that hasn't worked for us. We have 40 years of data and still the same kids are not doing well. Still, they're continuing to face all of these educational disparities and predicaments in ways that other kids aren't. We're not doing something right. So we have to think about it and take the things that we are doing. And of course, the sacrifice, you want to take away my kids' education fund? Well, then let's imagine an education that every single one of our children can be assured. An education that has generations and people and plants and animals and responsibility and community and science and technology and engineering and math and energy sustainability and water justice. Why the heck not, right? So that's what we're asking. And again, we all put our hands in and say, who's with me? Because that's our responsibility. So we ask you to think about the question, right? Yeah, it's uncomfortable. I don't want to give up my job or my 401k and all that kind of stuff, but I sure as heck can contribute to imagining what that otherwise looks like in a way that we don't have to be worried about what am I going to give up? And we're already doing a lot of this work. We're coming together. We're acknowledging the importance of heterogeneous and diverse perspectives toward innovation and transformation. We recognize that the stories and spaces and experiences that we share every single day transform the way that we see the world, so that maybe the next time we do something differently. As individuals, we become better selves. As communities, we become more thriving, and to ensure all of our members work through. So think about your own spaces and think about your own relationships and your own projects. What are we already doing individually or collectively that's contributing to this transformation? If you're a decision maker, and every single one of us are, who's deciding about things like money and hiring and agency? In what ways are we pushing back against that status quo so that eventually I'm comfortable saying, yep, take away my 401k, I'm good. Right? Because I don't want just me to have it. I want you to have it too. So let's think about that. And we can go ahead and just so that we can have a cascading vigilance in the chat box here, go ahead and type it in your in the chat box and let's get ready to send it to everyone. What are you doing right now that you can feel most proud about as you walk away? And if that's not coming to you immediately, what is the take home for you today? You've come to this conversation with an open heart, and it's your responsibility to share what you know. In Coast Salish communities and tradition, we call this bearing witness. So you can think about that too. What are you going to take to share with others? What resonated with you? And then on the count of three, as you're thinking, I'll stop talking and give you a second to think. And then I'll count to three. And on the count of three, we'll just go ahead and see the beautiful things that are already taking place. Okay, everyone, that was 18 Mississippis. 11 Mississippis is actually a pedagogical strategy. So on the count of three, we will cascade our vigilance to identify the ways in which we're already contributing to the revolution. 1, 2, 3. Yay, look at that. This is exciting, and I'm so excited to go ahead and read through all of these and spend a little bit more time. But I appreciate you, and I'm going to hand it over to Tim. Is there anything that's jumping out at you or any thoughts?
Sorry. In this moment, I'm just I'm filled with hope about the ways that we can collectively come together, the ways that so many of you are already imagining the otherwise, are already moving beyond and into that other world where we walk lightly and in different ways, and rely on education broadly in order to teach our youth how to be impactful in this world, and how to navigate this changing world. And so just seeing that cascade again just brought more feeling to me. So it came full circle. And then just wanted to read this final quote that we'll leave with you all. It says, "And while each individual must have the skills and knowledge to ensure their own safety, survival, and prosperity in both the physical and spiritual realm, their existence is ultimately dependent upon intimate relationships of reciprocity, humility, honesty, and respect with all the elements of creation, including plants and animals." So we just want to thank you for being with us today, and sharing space with us.
Haitsapka siamnatsiaya tlam utsia tala haitsapka ni altmets atana quail yath ut hakoshta not so much squallowing haitsapka. And I just wanted to say not so much squallowing is one heart, one mind in my own language. And I saw a conversation previously about folks sharing their language about that common sentiment. We recognize that, at the end of our time here on earth, we don't ask for those Rolexes and those degrees and all these fancy accolades. And has someone seen my CV these days, right? We don't. That's ridiculous. We ask for our loved ones. We ask for our family. We ask for our people. And we recognize nothing matters more than these relationships. So as educators and as researchers, we need to think about these things in relation to the young people and the communities that we're serving and collaborating with. And only then can we begin to think about innovative strategies that we can get ourselves out of this collective tricky moment. I say tricky moment with my 3-year-old. It's a little bit more than that, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So we're grateful to all of you for joining us. Haitsapka.
Thank you very much, Emma and Tim, for that powerful presentation. I feel like you captured the spirit and humanity of Indigenous people with the tone of the presentation and the depth of the presentation. At this time, we do have a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes left. That may be time for one question or a comment. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand. Or Helen, did I see your hand go up? Be careful about moving your hands right now.
No, sorry, I'm just listening. This is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Lots of thank yous in the chat. If there's anything in the chat before I close out.
I was having this reflection today about this conversation about storying, and we have a storyteller, and we have a story listener, and we have the story itself, and we have how all of these pieces sort of are interactive and dynamic. That's why if you tell me something, I'm not going to go and share it with everybody else, in our community. We call that gossiping. Anyway, these stories are your own, right? And I just wanted to point out, even though they're dynamic and changing and all of these kinds of things, there is also something individual or, so if you're imagining some kind of a conceptual framework, which hasn't, we didn't develop this or anything, but there's an individual level of what that story does for your own individual so it's, I guess I'm just trying to say that it's also dynamic and interactive with oneself. So even though we're talking about social responsibility and social relationships and stories and the nature of stories that are alive between, say, two people, I think that there's also an element of being alive for oneself, because I've shared with my own self different stories at different parts of my own time privately, right, to myself or as I reflect and so on. And those have shaped who I think, shaped my healing processes and shaped who I think I am and all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's just another shout out to that dynamic nature of stories and storytelling about knowledge and co-construction and those kinds of things.
I just wanted to share a brief story about just this activity that I did in class in my culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies class. Shout out to them. But I asked them to, and you're welcome to borrow this activity if you want. I asked them to think about an educator in their life, and I wasn't specific to say teacher, an educator in their life that impacted them in positive and productive ways. And I had them list out the traits of what it meant, or the traits of that teacher that they reflected upon, and listed those on the board. And then I created sort of an XY axis where I had curriculum, and then at the bottom, pedagogy. And then on one side, I had content knowledge, and then on the other, I had caring. And we sort of charted where, like, if we were to rank the words that they had listed in those 4 sections of curriculum and pedagogy, of content knowledge and caring, where would it be? And so we sort of mapped out where that line was, or where that point was. And for so many of them, it was so deeply rooted in caring and in pedagogy, the ways that we teach and learn. And so I think that just connects with the lesson that Emma, you were offering, that we need to know that connection. We need to feel that connection. We need to know that people care about our existence. And so that's what I'm leaving with, is just the importance of relationships, of sharing space, and for seeing people in their wholeness, even with our flaws and mistakes visible.
Shay, thank you all for coming. For family members, I'm going to hang on here a few minutes. If you want to talk, let me stop recording this. And thank you again, Tim and Emma. I will be in touch with you.